Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Is Nick or Jack the one being betrayed when Phyllis double-crosses Kane? According to teasers for The Young and the Restless, Phyllis Summers might betray Kane Ashby. However, would she betray him for Jack Abbott or Nick Newman? Phyllis has been putting a lot of effort into persuading Kane that she supports his scheme to take over Genoa City. But is she sincere? Let's be honest, Phyllis hasn't demonstrated many qualities of reliability. Even though Phyllis appears dedicated to aiding Kane at the moment, that could undoubtedly change as the plot develops. It almost seemed like a clue as to the direction this plot is taking when Phyllis brought up the fact that no one plays her and gets away with it. In certain instances, Phyllis can feel deceived by Kane and choose to take revenge. In any case, Kane can't really rely on Phyllis' devotion to him. This Kane narrative is evocative in many respects of Tucker McCall's return to the scene and his subsequent power moves. Fans may remember how Phyllis betrayed Tucker for the Abbotts, which infuriated him. It is important to remember that Phyllis even went so far as to hack Tucker for Jack. By having Phyllis abandon Kane and join Team Abbott, the program might choose to replicate that plot. There is another person, though, who might be worth betraying Kane for. Kane didn't appear convinced that Phyllis would actually be willing to betray Nick when she first approached him about joining forces. Perhaps Phyllis will ultimately prioritize her allegiance to Nick. In the end, we saw Nick persuading Phyllis to support him and defend his family. There is no assurance that they would establish an alliance, but Victor Newman wants to use Kane to destroy Jabbo. Furthermore, Victor would be wise to begin covertly defending himself now in case Kane decides to target Newman Enterprises next. This leads us back to Phyllis and the potential for her to turn against Kane, particularly if it means Nick. Because of their past romance and their shared connection to Summer Newman, Phyllis will always feel a connection to Nick. Since Phyllis has been so focused on getting Daniel Romalotti Jr. a job, Nick might even persuade Victor to offer her a bright new business to oversee, one that has the ideal position to excite him. Phyllis might be open to playing for Team Newman given Nick's influence over her and anything Victor might add to make things more agreeable. Stay back for more on Phyllis' cunning behavior and any additional betrayals that may be imminent, as The Young and the Restless spoilers indicate that Kane may have terrible news cooking on several fronts. Phyllis Summers has always been a dangerous wildcard in Genoa City, the kind of person who can play both sides of a scheme and smile sweetly while planting the knife in your back. And this latest alliance with Kane Ashby is already teetering on the edge of implosion even before the ink on their unspoken deal has metaphorically dried, because as much as Kane likes to believe he's the one manipulating the board, the truth is Phyllis doesn't take orders from anyone unless it's part of her own larger plan, and she's already begun weighing the potential benefits of jumping ship, her sharp mind running through scenarios like an elite chess player anticipating 20 moves ahead, especially now that subtle cracks are showing in Kane's confident veneer. From the moment Phyllis agreed to join his quest for Genoa City domination, there's been an undercurrent of suspicion in her eyes, a flicker of calculation that says she's not fully sold on this long-term partnership, because Kane's ambitions are dangerous, messy, and perhaps most importantly unlikely to allow her the kind of control she craves. And while she's played the role of eager co-conspirator perfectly, laughing at his jabs, feeding his ego, and offering just enough intel to make herself valuable, she's also been quietly keeping mental receipts, noting every instance where Kane's promises ring hollow, where his strategies reveal vulnerabilities, and most critically, where he underestimates her. Phyllis has said it before: no one plays her and gets away with it, and those words now feel like an ominous foreshadowing of the moment she'll turn the tables, a moment she's starting to see as inevitable. And if that turn comes, the question is not if she'll betray Kane but for whom, because two very different names loom in her decision-making process: Jack Abbott, the former lover who still stirs a complex blend of affection, rivalry, and unfinished business in her, and Nick Newman, the man who shares her history, her daughter Summer, and perhaps still a piece of her heart. In some ways, betraying Kane for Jack would be the most straightforward path, a kind of sequel to her past move against Tucker McCall when she hacked him for the Abbotts, earning Jack's gratitude and positioning herself once again as a savior to Jabbo. And given that Kane's current trajectory has him aiming his sights directly at the Abbott empire, Phyllis could easily justify switching teams as a defensive measure to protect the Abbotts from yet another ruthless corporate takeover. But there's also an undeniable allure to siding with Nick, especially when his quiet loyalty, moral compass, and ability to appeal to her better instincts often pull her back from the brink. The problem is that Nick doesn't just want Kane stopped, he wants his family protected, and Phyllis knows that aligning with him could mean actively working against Victor. Newman, who, in his current mood, seems more than willing to unleash Kane like a guided missile on Jabbo before inevitably having to defuse that same threat when Kane's crosshairs inevitably shift toward Newman Enterprises. A scenario that makes Phyllis' potential defection all the more valuable to Nick, because she could serve as an inside operative, feeding him Kane's plans in real time while helping Victor construct a safety net. Of course, the devil in Phyllis whispers that Victor might sweeten the deal himself, offering her a lucrative company to run, one that not only cements her power in the corporate world but also gives her the perfect position to lure Daniel Romalotti Jr. into a job he actually wants, solving a personal mission she's been fixated on for months. And if that happens, suddenly Team Newman looks less like a favor to Nick and more like an irresistible business opportunity that happens to take down a partner she was never fully invested in. Still, Phyllis knows that in order to make her betrayal stick, she has to time it perfectly too early, and Kane will have the chance to retaliate too late, and the damage he inflicts on Jack, Nick, or Newman Enterprises might be irreversible, so she plays the long game, nodding along to his grand speeches while mentally marking the weak spots in his armor, smiling in crimson lights while Kane brags about how Victor's just a pawn in his greater strategy, knowing full well that overconfidence is the chink she can exploit. Yet even as she plots, there's a sliver of genuine intrigue in her partnership with Kane, a part of her that enjoys the dance of two predators circling each other, both knowing only one will survive. And perhaps that's why the stakes feel so personal, because whether she ultimately hands Kane over to Jack, Nick, or both, she's aware that the move will define her reputation for years to come. Will she be seen as the brilliant tactician who saved Genoa City's power balance, or the backstabber who played one too many games and finally burned her last bridge? As Phyllis drinks her martini at society, she looks at the door as though anticipating either Jack's worried eyes or Nick's silent smirk. She knows that the time for decision-making is approaching, and she will make it with the same fierce confidence that has seen her through every feud, scheme, and so-called alliance because, in the end, Phyllis Summers doesn't lose. She just modifies the rules until the game is hers. Phyllis Summers wasn't just sitting in Kane Ashby's orbit because she enjoyed the view, she was there because she saw something dangerous in him, something that reminded her of a younger, hungrier version of herself, a version that burned bridges without hesitation and reinvented herself in the ashes. But Phyllis knew better now. She'd been through too many public humiliations, too many stints on the outside looking in, to gamble without having an escape plan. And with Kane's ego expanding daily, and his appetite for risk growing reckless, she was already designing 3 different exits from their alliance, one for Jack Abbott, one for Nick Newman, and one where she walked away entirely and took something valuable with her. Because why settle for just surviving when she could profit? Still, the pull between Jack and Nick complicated matters in ways she didn't like to admit even to herself, because Jack had always been her great intellectual equal, the one who could match her in both wit and ruthlessness, while Nick represented the softer pull of loyalty, romance, and the unbreakable bond of co-parenting Summer. And every time she thought she'd chosen a direction, something happened to tip the scales back, like Jack's recent subtle hints that he might need an insider at Chancellor Winters to sniff out Kane's moves, or Nick's quiet confession over coffee that Victor was playing with fire and might get burned if Kane wasn't stopped. She could hear the unspoken plea in Nick's voice. A plea that brought back a flood of memories, late nights in the Newman kitchen, arguments that turned into passionate reconciliations, the way they'd once dreamed about building something lasting together, and it made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, the old connection could be rekindled if she proved herself in a way that counted. The trouble was, Phyllis didn't trust her own nostalgia. Because nostalgia was dangerous, it made you act on feelings instead of facts. And facts were what she needed right now, so she started quietly gathering them, slipping questions into casual conversations with Kane's associates, hacking into email chains that he thought were locked down, planting herself in the right place at the right time to overhear whispers about backroom deals, all the while feeding Kane just enough useful intel to keep him convinced she was loyal. Because a good double-cross didn't happen overnight, it was cultivated, watered with just the right mix of truth and lies until the target never saw the blade coming. The Real test came when Kane floated his latest plan over drinks at the Grand Phoenix, a plan so bold it made even Phyllis blink. He intended to destabilize Jabot's supply chain through a dummy corporation, force Jack to buy overpriced materials from a front company, then publicly expose the financial strain to tank Jabot's stock, making it ripe for a hostile takeover. It was exactly the kind of scorched earth maneuver that could leave Jack in ruins, and as Kane laid it out with a grin, Phyllis found herself picturing Jack's face when he realized too late who was behind it. Then, just as quickly, she pictured Nick's face if Newman Enterprises became the next target, and the two images collided in her head like a train wreck, each demanding a different path forward. She played along, of course, leaning in with her trademark smirk, offering to massage the numbers, in the press to make the takedown look like a natural market collapse. But even as she spoke, she was running calculations in her mind how much time she had before Kane moved, who she could tip off without drawing suspicion, and whether she could maneuver it so both Jack and Nick saw her as the savior. The answer, she realized, was yes, but it would require precision, and precision meant patience, so she kept her cool, biding her time until the moment presented itself. In the meantime, she tested the waters, dropping a vague warning to Jack about storm clouds over the supply chain and watching his brow furrow, hinting to Nick that Victor's new golden boy might be plotting something even the great Victor Newman can't control, and seeing the concern flash in his eyes. And with each reaction, Phyllis felt the power shifting, her influence growing, until she was no longer just Kane's partner in crime. She was the pivot point in a game of corporate survival. But the higher the stakes climbed, the more she understood the risk, because Kane wasn't blind. He might be arrogant, but arrogance didn't mean stupidity. And every so often she'd catch him watching her a little too closely, as if trying to read the thoughts she kept locked behind her sharp smile. And she knew if he caught even a whiff of betrayal, he'd move first. And Kane's version of moving first wouldn't just mean cutting her out of the deal, it could mean ruining her entirely, dragging her name through the mud until she had nowhere to land. That was why she started preparing her nuclear option. A dossier of Kane's most incriminating moves, compiled from hacked files, overheard conversations, and a few strategically planted moles, the kind of insurance policy that could buy her freedom or leverage at a moment's notice. And the beauty of it was that she could hand it to Jack, Nick, or even Victor, depending on which way the wind blew. Still, she knew she couldn't delay forever. The clock was ticking, and Kane's plan against Jabot was moving into its final stages. So when Jack called her out of the blue to ask if she'd be willing to meet in private, she didn't hesitate, knowing that this might be the moment to align herself with him. But the meeting was a curveball. Instead of begging for her help, Jack offered her something unexpected. A genuine apology for past betrayals and a quiet acknowledgement that, despite everything, he still respected her as one of the sharpest minds in Genoa City. It threw her off balance, and for a moment she considered going all in on Team Abbott, handing him the dossier and letting the chips fall. But then she remembered Nick, remembered the way his voice had tightened when he'd said, "I don't trust this Kane guy." And she realized she wasn't ready to close the door on him either. So she did what Phyllis Summers does best. She walked the knife's edge, telling Jack just enough to make him wary but not enough to act, then meeting Nick later that night at society under the pretense of catching up about summer, slipping in a few carefully chosen lines about a corporate tsunami heading for Newman waters without naming names, watching his protective instincts flare as she expected. By the time she left, she'd all but secured her position as the secret linchpin in both men's strategies, the one person who could stop Kane. And that was exactly where she wanted to be, because it meant she could decide not just if Kane went down, but how, when, and for whose benefit. And that kind of power was intoxicating, the kind that made her blood hum with anticipation. The final play, she knew, would have to be spectacular, something worthy of her reputation. So she envisioned the scene, Kane cornered in his own office, blindsided by a media leak that destroyed his takeover plan, forced to watch as Jack shored up Jabot's defenses and Nick emerged unscathed, both men looking to her with gratitude and maybe a hint of awe. But whether she gave that victory to Jack, to Nick, or split it between them was a decision she'd keep to herself until the last possible second, because the truth was, Phyllis didn't fully know which way she'd go, not yet. And maybe she liked it that way. Maybe keeping the choice alive was its own kind of thrill, a reminder that in a town full of power players, she was still one of the few who could move the board without anyone realizing until it was too late. For now, she'd keep smiling at Kane, keep playing the role of the loyal co-architect of his empire, keep sipping her wine as if she didn't have the power to burn it all to the ground, because when the day came, And it would come. Phyllis Summers would make sure the betrayal was unforgettable, and that when the dust settled, she was standing exactly where she wanted to be. At the top, with the whole of Genoa City wondering how she'd done it and no one able to prove a thing. Phyllis knew better than most that timing was everything, and while she was playing Kane close to the vest, she was also watching for the slightest sign that he might suspect her, because in the ruthless game they were both playing, a single misstep could cost her everything. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Kane wasn't just a threat to Jack or Nick, he was a threat to her own survival, her carefully constructed identity as a power player in Genoa City. So she began subtly testing his reactions, throwing out ambiguous comments about loyalty and trust during their strategy sessions, gauging his responses like a scientist analyzing a volatile chemical reaction. And each time he dismissed her concerns or brushed her off with a smirk, her resolve hardened. Because if Kane thought he could underestimate Phyllis, he was sorely mistaken, and while she was willing to keep him close for now, the plan to pull the rug out from under him had to be flawless, a perfect storm of betrayal that would leave no room for doubt or reprisal. Meanwhile, her interactions with Jack and Nick grew more nuanced. Jack, with his steady confidence and old money charm, appealed to her competitive side, reminding her of the thrill of the high-stakes game, while Nick, with his steady presence and shared history, appealed to something softer inside her, a flicker of hope that maybe alliances could be more than just transactions. But every meeting, every whispered conversation, served as another layer of armor, another piece of her intricate puzzle, and Phyllis knew that when the time came to choose, she would weigh not only the strategic benefits but also the emotional costs, because in Genoa City, loyalty was often as much about heart as it was about power, and even the hardest players like her sometimes found themselves caught in between. Yet as the days ticked by and Kane's plan edged closer to execution, Phyllis felt the pressure mounting, like a volcano about to erupt, and though she wore her usual mask of confidence, inside she was a whirlwind of calculation and caution, preparing every possible scenario for the fallout, knowing that the stakes were not just about corporate dominance but about who controlled the narrative, who survived the scandal, and who ultimately dictated the future of the city's most powerful families. And as she sat alone late one night in her penthouse, reviewing the dossier she'd compiled on Kane, a small, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips, because this wasn't just a game of betrayal, it was her moment to redefine herself, to prove once again that Phyllis Summers was not just a survivor but a queenmaker, a woman who shaped destinies while everyone else was too busy fighting over scraps. And with that thought solidifying her resolve, she finally allowed herself a breath of anticipation for the chaos she was about to unleash, knowing full well that once the double cross was in motion, nothing, and no one, would ever be the same.